A single gunshot echoes through Warrington Manor, shattering the quiet of an English countryside evening. General Sir Henry Warrington, a war hero, is wounded in his locked armory, impossible yet true. Who breached this fortress of rifles and secrets? His loyal aide, hiding ambition. His elegant wife, nursing silent resentment. His nervous orderly, caught in petty thefts. Or his old rival, driven by a decades-old grudge. Enter Miss Jane Marple, a gentle spinster with a razor-sharp mind, unraveling lies, cobwebs, and hidden motives to reveal a truth as cunning as the crime itself. In a house of shadows, one shot will expose a killer. Chapter 1. The Armory Incident. The late summer evening draped St. Mary's down in a golden hush, its quiet lanes and hedgerows bathed in the soft glow of dusk. Warrington Manor, a stern Georgian pile at the edge of the village, stood as a monument to order and tradition, its ivy-clad walls guarding the secrets of its inhabitants. Within its shadowed halls, General Sir Henry Warrington, a man whose name carried the weight of military triumphs, was known to retreat each evening to his armoria, sanctuary of polished rifles, campaign maps, and memories of battles long past. It was here, at precisely 10 minutes to 7, that the sharp crack of a gunshot pierced the stillness, sending rooks scattering from the manor's ancient oaks. Miss Jane Marple, seated in the drawing-room with her old friend, Lady Beatrice Warrington, paused mid-stitch, her knitting needles hovering like delicate antennae. The sound was unmistakable, its echo lingering in the air like an unwelcome guest. Beatrice, a slight woman with a penchant for nervous chatter, dropped her teacup, the porcelain clattering against the saucer. "Good heavens, Jane, was that?" she began, but the butler, Mr. Harrow, burst into the room, his usually composed face ashen. "Madame, it's the General," he stammered. "He's been shot in the armory." Miss Marple's eyes, bright and bird-like behind her spectacles, met Beatrice's. Without a word, she set her knitting aside and rose, her movements calm but purposeful. "We must see to him at once," she said, her voice steady, though her mind was already turning over the implications. A shooting in a locked armory. No less such things did not happen by chance in a house like this. They found the armory door ajar, the heavy oak panel swinging inward to reveal a scene of controlled chaos. Sir Henry lay slumped in his leather chair, his right shoulder stained crimson, the air sharp with the acrid tang of gunpowder. A single brass bullet casing glinted on the polished floor beside his desk, its presence as jarring as a false note in a symphony. The village doctor, Dr. Grayson, knelt beside him, his fingers probing the wound with practiced care. "He'll live," Grayson said gruffly, "but the bullets lodged deep. He needs rest." Sir Henry, his face pale but resolute, stirred at the sound of voices, didn't see. "Too quick," he muttered, his words slurred as if dragged from a great distance. His eyes, usually so commanding, flickered with confusion before he sank back, unconscious. Miss Marple's gaze swept the room. The rows of rifles mounted on the walls, their barrels gleaming under the lamplight. The narrow window latched shut against the evening chill. The desk, strewn with papers and a half-empty glass of brandy. The key remained in the lock, its brass surface catching the light. "Locked from the inside," Harrow confirmed, his voice low. "I had to turn it to enter." Beatrice clutched Miss Marple's arm, her breath uneven. "Who could have done this, Jane?" The door was locked, the window barred. How could anyone get in? Miss Marple patted her hand absently, her attention fixed on the room's details. A faint smudge on the windowsill, a single thread caught on the latch. People are remarkably resourceful, Beatrice, she said softly, when they have cause to be. Inspector Crawley arrived within the hour, a solid man with a methodical air and a notebook already in hand. He listened as Harrow recounted the evening's events. The household had been quiet, the general retiring to the armory after dinner, as was his custom. No one had reported seeing strangers, and the Manors staff loyal to no one had passed the main corridors unnoticed. Crawley's questions were precise, but Miss Marple sensed his frustration. A locked room, a wounded man, and no weapon in sight. This was no ordinary crime. As the inspector began his inquiries, Miss Marple lingered by the armory door, her fingers tracing the lock's edge. She recalled a similar incident in St. Mary, Mead, where a locked door had hidden not a mystery but a simple human truth. The armory, she mused aloud, is a place of control, of precision. Yet someone disrupted it with a single, reckless act. Beatrice, hovering nearby, wrung her hands. But why, Jane? Henry's a hard man, but he's respected. Who would dare? Miss Marple did not answer, her thoughts already weaving a pattern. From the evening's fragments the general's past, his household, his enemy's edge held a thread, and she would follow them all. For now, she returned to the drawing room, her knitting resumed, but her mind was far from idle. In St. Mary's, down, as in her own village, secrets had a way of surfacing, and Miss Marple intended to find them. Chapter 2. The suspects assemble. The morning after the shooting at Warrington Manor dawned with a deceptive calm, as if the village of St. Mary's Down wished to smooth over the violence of the previous evening with a veil of mist and birdsong. The sun, filtering through the heavy drapes of the manor's dining room, cast long shadows across the mahogany table where the household gathered for breakfast. The air was thick with unspoken questions, and the clink of porcelain against silver seemed unnaturally loud, as though each sound were a challenge to the silence that hung over the room. Miss Jane Marple, seated near the window with her knitting tucked discreetly in her lap, observed the scene with the quiet intensity of a naturalist studying a rare species. Her visit to her old friend, Lady Beatrice Warrington, widow of Sir Henry's late brother, had taken an unexpected turn, and she found herself at the heart of a puzzle that demanded her attention. The table was set for 5, though only 4 were present: Captain Roger Blake, Sir Henry's aide; Lady Eleanor Warrington, the General's wife; Private Thomas Gibbs, the orderly; and Colonel Marcus Vane, a guest whose presence in the village had raised eyebrows. Sir Henry himself remained upstairs, under Dr. Grayson's care, his condition stable but his temper reportedly frayed. Beatrice, presiding over the meal with a nervous flutter, had insisted Miss Marple join them, her trust in her friend's quiet wisdom unspoken but evident. The butler, Mr. Harrow, moved with his usual precision, though his eyes darted toward the guests with a wariness. Miss Marple noted at once Captain Blake, a man of perhaps 35, cut a striking figure in his neatly pressed uniform, his dark hair combed back with military precision. Yet his hands betrayed him, fingers drumming an erratic rhythm on the tablecloth, his coffee untouched. He had been Sir Henry's aide for nearly a decade, a position that spoke of loyalty, yet his restlessness suggested something unspokener, discontent, perhaps, or a secret. Miss Marple recalled Beatrice's mention of Blake's rapid rise under Sir Henry's patronage, a fact that could breed gratitude or resentment, depending on the man. Across from him sat Lady Eleanor, her beauty as polished as the silverware before her. Her auburn hair was swept into an elegant chignon, and her silk dress a muted shade of green. spoke of wealth and restraint. She sipped her tea with a grace that seemed almost rehearsed, her eyes fixed on some distant point beyond the room. There was a coolness to her, a detachment that Miss Marple found intriguing. Beatrice had confided that Eleanor and Sir Henry's marriage, though outwardly proper, had grown strained in recent years, marked by silences and sharp words. Eleanor's composure this morning was admirable, but Miss Marple wondered what lay beneath it. Private Gibbs, the orderly, was a contrast in every way. A wiry young man with a pinched face and nervous eyes, he sat at the table's edge, as if unsure of his right to be there. His role in the household was humble, polishing boots, running errands, maintaining the Armory's meticulous order, yet his presence at breakfast, at Beatrice's insistence, spoke of her kindness toward the staff. Gibbs's hands trembled slightly as he reached for a slice of toast, and he avoided meeting anyone's gaze. Miss Marple noted the calluses on his fingers, the mark of a man accustomed to manual work, and recalled a whispered rumor from the housekeeper that Gibbs had been caught taking small items from the manor silver spoon. A pocket knife, though Sir Henry had chosen not to dismiss him. Colonel Vane, the final figure at the table, sat apart, his broad shoulders hunched as he stared out the window toward the manicured gardens. His face, weathered and scarred from years of service, carried the weight of old battles, and his grey eyes held a hardness that Miss Marple found both compelling and unsettling. A contemporary of Sir Henry's from their days in the Boer War. Vane was a guest at the village inn, not the manor, yet his presence here this morning suggested a connection to the events of the previous night. Beatrice had mentioned a long-standing rivalry between the two men, a feud born of some military misstep that neither had fully forgotten. Vane's silence at the table was heavy, broken only by the occasional grunt as he cut into his bacon. Miss Marple, her knitting needles clicking softly, let her eyes drift from one face to another, her mind cataloguing each gesture, each glance. A curious gathering, she remarked to Beatrice, her voice light but her thoughts anything but. In her experience, people revealed themselves most clearly in moments of strain, and this breakfast table was a study in tension. The shooting of Sir Henry, locked in his armory, was no random act, and the four people before her held the key to its unravelling. Inspector Crawley entered the room, his notebook tucked under his arm, his expression one of determined focus. A man of middle years, with a solid build and a moustache that seemed to bristle with authority. He had already earned Miss Marple's respect for his thoroughness, if not his imagination. "Good morning," he said, his tone clipped. "I'll need to speak with each of you again today. The General's condition is stable, but we've a serious matter to resolve." His eyes swept the table, lingering briefly on each suspect, and Miss Marple noted the slight tightening of Captain Blake's jaw, the faint flush on Lady Eleanor's cheeks. Beatrice, ever the anxious hostess, offered the inspector tea, which he declined with a polite nod. "Miss Marple," he said, turning to her, "Lady Beatrice tells me you've a knack for these things. I'd value your thoughts, if you're willing." His tone was formal, but Miss Marple detected a hint of curiosity. She smiled, her expression as mild as a summer afternoon. "I'm merely a guest, Inspector, but I'm happy to observe. People, you know, are often more revealing than they intend." The meal continued in uneasy silence, broken only by the occasional murmur of conversation. Captain Blake spoke briefly of the weather, his voice strained, while Lady Eleanor commented on the roses in the garden, her words precise but hollow. Gibbs said nothing, his eyes fixed on his plate, and Vane's only contribution was a curt Remark about the quality of the coffee. Miss Marple listened, her needles moving rhythmically, her mind sifting through the fragments of their behavior. She had seen such gatherings before, in her own village of St. Mary Mead, where polite surfaces often concealed darker currents. After breakfast, as the others dispersed, Miss Marple lingered in the dining room, her eyes drawn to the window where Colonel Vane had sat. She stepped closer, noting a faint smudge on the glass, as if someone had pressed their hand against it. It was a small detail, but Miss Marple had learned to trust such things. She recalled a case in St. Mary Mead where a smudge on a teacup had pointed to a lie, and she wondered what this mark might reveal. Beatrice joined her, her face pale with worry. "Jane, what do you make of it all?" she asked, her voice low. "Henry's enemies are few, but they're fierce. Could one of them have done this?" Miss Marple patted her friend's hand, her touch gentle but firm. "Enemies, Beatrice, are often closer than we think, but we mustn't jump to conclusions. Tell me, what do you know of these four?" Beatrice hesitated, then spoke in a rush, as if unburdening herself. "Captain Blake," she said, "had been a protege of Sir Henry S., plucked from obscurity after a chance meeting during a campaign in India. His loyalty was unquestioned, but his recent moodiness had puzzled the household. Lady Eleanor, married to Sir Henry for 15 years, had once been a vibrant presence, but her warmth had faded, replaced by a quiet resentment. Beatrice suspected financial strain, though the general's wealth was substantial. Private Gibbs, a recent addition, was a hard worker despite his petty thefts, and Sir Henry's leniency toward him had surprised everyone. As for Colonel Vane, his history with Sir Henry was murky, tangled in a long-ago dispute over a battle plan that had cost lives and reputations. Miss Marple listened, her needles pausing as she absorbed the details. "A household is like a village," she said at last. "Everyone knows more than they say, and no one is quite what they seem." She thought of her own neighbours in St. Mary, me the vicar's wife, with her hidden sorrows. The chemist with his secret debt sand knew that Warrington Manor held similar truths. As the morning progressed, Inspector Crawley began his interviews, summoning each suspect to the library. Miss Marple, at Beatrice's urging, joined him. Sitting quietly in a corner with her knitting, her presence unobtrusive but her senses sharp. Captain Blake was first, his posture rigid as he recounted his movements the previous evening. He claimed to have been in the library reading a military history when the shot rang out. Mr. Harrow confirmed seeing him there earlier, but no one could place him at the exact moment of the crime. Blake's eyes flickered toward the door, and Miss Marple noted a faint stain on his cuff mud, perhaps, or something more telling. Lady Eleanor followed, her voice cool as she described her evening in her private sitting room, alone with a novel. No one could corroborate her story, and Miss Marple wondered at the absence of emotion in her account. Private Gibbs, visibly nervous, mumbled about polishing silver in the pantry, but the housekeeper's report of his half-hour absence cast doubt on his words. Colonel Vane, last to be questioned, was brusque, claiming he'd been at the village inn, dining alone. The innkeeper's vague recollection left room for uncertainty, and Miss Marple noted Vane's steady gaze, as if he were accustomed to facing scrutiny. By noon, the interviews were complete, and Inspector Crawley shared his findings with Miss Marple over a cup of tea in the drawing-room. No weapon, no clear entry, and for people with no solid alibis, he said, rubbing his temples. The armory was locked, the window latched. How did they do it? Miss Marple smiled faintly, her eyes on her knitting. Locks and latches, Inspector, are only as secure as the hands that turn them. I once knew a gardener in St. Mary Mead who swore his shed was impregnable, yet a child with a hairpin proved him wrong. Crawley raised an eyebrow, but Miss Marple continued, her tone gentle. We must look at the people, not just the room. Each of these four has a reason to resent Sir Henry, or so it seems. But resentment alone does not pull a trigger. We need to know their hearts. She thought of the smudge on the window, the mud on Blake's cuff, the tremble in Gibbs's hands, and the steel in Vane's eyes. The pieces were there, waiting to be fitted together. As the day wore on, Miss Marple strolled through the manor's gardens, her shawl drawn about her shoulders against the autumn chill. She paused by the armory's exterior wall, her eyes tracing the narrow window's frame. A faint scratch on the sill caught her attention, and she bent closer, her fingers brushing the stone. It was a small mark, easily overlooked, but Miss Marple had learned to trust such clues. In St. Mary Mead, a scratch on a gatepost had once led to a thief's confession, and she wondered what this one might reveal. Returning to the house, she found Beatrice in the hall, her face drawn. "Jane, do you think we'll ever know the truth?" she asked. Miss Marple's smile was reassuring, though her thoughts were far from certain. "Truth, my dear, is like a garden. It takes time to uncover what lies beneath the surface, but it's there, waiting for those who know where to look." She resumed her knitting, her needles clicking softly. As the manor settled into an uneasy quiet, its secrets biding their time. Chapter 3. The locked room. Puzzled the afternoon sun cast long, slanting rays through the tall windows of Warrington Manor, gilding the sombre corridors with a deceptive warmth. Miss Jane Marple, her shawl draped neatly over her shoulders, moved, with quiet purpose, toward the armory, where the mystery of General Sir Henry Warrington's shooting lay locked in more ways than one. Inspector Crawley had invited her to examine the scene, his respect for her reputation tempered by a faint skepticism that a spinster from St. Mary Mead could unravel what his trained eye had yet to decipher. Miss Marple, for her part, welcomed the opportunity, her mind as sharp as the needles tucked into her knitting bag. The armory was a fortress within the manor, its heavy oak door reinforced with iron bands, a relic of an earlier, more turbulent era. As Miss Marple stepped inside, the air carried the faint tang of gunpowder, now mingled with the musty scent of old leather and polished wood. The room was a shrine to Sir Henry's military past. Rows of rifles gleamed on racks along the walls, their barrels aligned with parade ground precision. Campaign maps, yellowed with age, hung framed above a mahogany desk, and a glass-fronted cabinet displayed medals and citations, their ribbons faded but proud. The desk itself, where Sir Henry had been found, bore the marks of the incidentous smear of dried blood, a toppled inkwell, and the solitary bullet casing that Inspector Crawley had left in place, marked by a chalk circle on the floor. Miss Marple's eyes, bright behind her spectacles, took in every detail. The window, narrow and set high in the wall, was latched shut, its iron frame unyielding. The key remained in the lock of the door, as Mr. Harrow had described, its position suggesting Sir Henry had locked himself in before the shot was fired. "A room designed to keep the world out," Miss Marple murmured, her voice soft but deliberate, yet someone found a way in. Inspector Crawley, standing by the desk, flipped open his notebook. "The facts are stubborn, Miss Marple," he said, his tone brisk but not unkind. "The door was locked when Harrow found him, the key inside. The window's too small for a man to climb through, and the latch hasn't been tampered with, far as I can tell." No gun was found, though we've searched the room top to bottom. The shot came from close range. Dr. Grayson's certain of that, but Sir Henry says he saw no one. It's a puzzle, and I don't mind admitting it." Miss Marple nodded, her expression one of polite interest, though her mind was already sifting through possibilities. She approached the window, her fingers brushing the sill where she had noticed a faint scratch the previous evening. It was still there, a thin, deliberate mark, as if made by a tool rather than an accident. She tested the latch, finding it firm but with a slight give, as though it had been worked loose over time. "Curious," she said, almost to herself, and bent closer, noting a single strand of cobweb, broken and clinging to the frame. It was a small thing, easily overlooked, but Miss Marple had learned in St. Mary Mead that small things often spoke loudest. She turned to the desk, her eyes lingering on the bullet casing. It was a .32 caliber, common enough but specific, suggesting a pistol rather than one of the rifles on display. She glanced at the racks, noting their orderly arrangement, and wondered if one had been handled recently. "Have you checked the weapons, Inspector?" she asked, her tone mild. Crawley nodded. "Every one, all accounted for, and none recently fired. The General's strict about his collection, keeps them unloaded, cleaned, and locked away. Gibbs, the orderly, swears he checked them that morning." Miss Marple's lips pursed slightly, as if tasting an unexpected flavor. "And yet a shot was fired," she said, "from a weapon that vanished as neatly as its owner." She moved to the cabinet of medals, her gaze lingering on a small gap between two frames, where the wood showed a faint ring of dust, as if something had been removed and replaced. She made no comment, but filed the observation away, like a stitch in her knitting. Crawley, watching her, cleared his throat. "You've a thought, Miss Marple?" "Only that people are clever, Inspector," she replied, her smile gentle but her eyes sharp. "In my village, I once knew a man who locked his shop every night. Yet thieves found a way in through a coal chute no one thought to check. We must consider what seems impossible." She glanced again at the window, her mind turning over the scratch and the cobweb. A locked room was only as secure as its weakest point, and she suspected this one had been breached by someone who knew its secrets. Leaving the armory, Miss Marple walked slowly through the manor's grounds, her stout shoes crunching on the gravel path. The armory's exterior wall faced a secluded corner of the garden, shielded by a high yew hedge that offered privacy and cover. She examined the ground beneath the window, noting the soft earth, undisturbed save for a single footprint, half hidden by a fern. It was faint, the heel barely discernible, but it suggested someone had stood there, perhaps watching or waiting. Miss Marple knelt, her shawl brushing the grass, and studied the mark. It was too shallow for a man's full weight, but it spoke of presence, of intent, as she rose. Beatrice appeared, her face pale against the dark silk of her dress. "Jane, you're poking about like a detective," she said, her voice half teasing, half anxious. "Have you found something?" "Only questions, my dear," Miss Marple replied, patting her friend's arm. "This house is full of them, and the answers are in the people who live here. Tell me, does Sir Henry ever open that window?" Beatrice frowned, thinking. "Rarely. He likes the armory cool, and the windows so small it hardly matters. But Gibbs airs it out now and then, when he cleans." Miss Marple nodded, her mind adding this to her pattern. And who else might know the room's habits? Captain Blake, perhaps, or Lady Eleanor. Beatrice hesitated. Roger Captain Blake spends time with Henry there, going over papers. Or plans. Eleanor avoids it. She says it smells of oil and history. Colonel Vane visited once or twice, years ago, but not lately. As for Gibbs, he's in and out, keeping things tidy. Miss Marple's eyes twinkled faintly. A room like that. Beatrice, is a stage. Everyone knows its entrances and exits, even if they pretend otherwise. She glanced back at the manor, where Inspector Crawley was emerging, his notebook still in hand. He approached, his expression one of cautious respect. Miss Marple. I've spoken to the staff again, he said. No one saw anything unusual before the shot. But the cook mentioned hearing a faint thud in the garden around 6:30, before dinner. Could be nothing, a branch falling, perhaps, but I've got men searching the grounds. A thud, Miss Marple repeated, her tone thoughtful. In St. Mary Mead, a thud once led us to a ladder left by a poacher. It's worth considering. She did not mention the footprint, preferring to let Crawley's men discover it themselves. Her role, she knew, was not to lead, but to guide, to see what others missed. As they returned to the house, Miss Marple's thoughts turned to the suspects. Captain Blake, with his restless hands and muddy cuff. Lady Eleanor, with her cool detachment. Private Gibbs, with his trembling fingers and questionable honesty. Colonel Vane, with his steely gaze and old grudges. Each had been in the manor that evening, each with access to the Armory's orbit, if not its heart. The locked room was a challenge, but Miss Marple suspected the true puzzle lay in their motives, their secrets, and the small, telling details that betrayed them in the drawing room. She resumed her knitting, the click of her needles, a steady counterpoint to the manor's tension. Beatrice, hovering nearby, wrung her hands. Jane, do you think it's one of them? Someone we've trusted. Miss Marple's smile was gentle but firm. Trust, Beatrice, is a fragile thing. In my village, I once knew a postmistress who seemed the soul of kindness, yet she opened letters to settle her own scores. We must look beyond appearances. As she spoke, her eyes drifted to the window, where the garden lay quiet, its secrets buried in the earth. The Armory's locked door was a riddle, but Miss Marple knew that human nature, with all its twists and tangles, would provide the key. Chapter 4. The Generals pass the soft patter of rain against the windows of Warrington Manor lent a sombre rhythm to the morning, as if the skies themselves were mourning the disturbance of the previous day's violence. Miss Jane Marple sat in the morning room, her knitting a quiet presence in her lap, her eyes fixed on the grey veil of mist that cloaked the gardens. The house was subdued, its usual bustle hushed by the weight of Sir Henry Warrington's injury and the shadow of suspicion that hung over its occupants. Inspector Crawley had spent the morning re-interviewing the staff, but Miss Marple knew that the key to the Armory's mystery lay not in routine questions but in the deeper currents of human history, particularly the General's own. Sir Henry, though weakened, was now well enough to receive visitors, and Miss Marple, under the pretext of bringing him a tray of tea, had secured an invitation to his bedside. Beatrice, ever anxious, had hesitated to let her friend venture alone into the lion's den. But Miss Marple's calm assurance had prevailed. A wounded man is often more candid, Beatrice, she said, her voice gentle but firm, and Sir Henry has stories that may shed light where we need it most. The General's bedroom was a cavernous space, its dark panelling and heavy drapes a testament to his austere tastes. Sir Henry lay propped against a mound of pillows, his face pale but his eyes sharp, their intensity undimmed by pain. A bandage, swayed his right shoulder, and a faint grimace crossed his features as he shifted to acknowledge Miss Marple's entrance. "Miss Marple, is it?" he said, his voice gruff but not unkind. "Beatrice speaks highly of you, says you've a knack for seeing through nonsense." Miss Marple smiled, setting the tea tray on a side table with the practiced ease of one accustomed to small courtesies. "I'm merely an observer, General," she replied, pouring a cup with steady hands. "But I find that people's pasts often explain their present troubles. Might you indulge an old woman's curiosity about yours?" Sir Henry's lips twitched, as if weighing whether to humour her. He took the offered cup, his fingers steady despite his injury, and sipped before speaking. "Not much to tell that isn't in the army records," he said. 40 years' service, campaigns in India, Africa, the Boer War, medals, scars. The usual tally, but his eyes, Miss Marple noted, darkened at the mention of the Boer War, and she leaned forward slightly, her expression one of polite interest. "The Boer War," she said, her tone light, as if discussing a village fete. "I've heard it was a hard campaign. Lady Beatrice mentioned a Colonel Vane, who served with you then, a friend, perhaps." Sir Henry's jaw tightened, and he set the cup down with a faint clink. "Vane was no friend," he said curtly. "A competent officer, but ambitious, too. Ambitious. There was an Operation Kronstadt, 1900. My plan, my execution, but Vane claimed credit. When it succeeded, he expected the laurels. When I got them instead, he never forgave me, called me a thief in all but name." His voice carried a bitter edge, and Miss Marple's needles paused, her mind filing away the grudge that had festered. For decades, she nodded sympathetically, her eyes soft but alert. "Old wounds linger, don't they? Like those in my village, where a quarrel over a garden fence outlasted the men who built it. But tell me, General, your household captain, Blake, for instance, a loyal aide, I understand." Sir Henry's expression softened slightly, though his tone remained guarded. "Roger's been with me 10 years. Good man, sharp mind. Owe him my life once. In India pulled me from a skirmish when my horse went down. He's restless lately, though talks of leaving, starting anew. Can't fathom why." He frowned, as if the thought troubled him more than he cared to admit. Miss Marple poured herself a cup, her movements deliberate, and Lady Eleanor, a devoted wife, no doubt. To manage such a household? Her words were innocent, but her eyes watched Sir Henry closely. The General's face clouded, and he looked away, toward the rain-streaked window. "Eleanor's a fine woman," he said, his voice clipped. "But marriage, it's not what. It was she's got her charities, her social rounds. I've got my work. We manage." The brevity of his answer spoke volumes, and Miss Marple noted the absence of warmth, the hint of distance that Beatrice had alluded to, and young Gibbs. She pressed gently, her tone as mild as if discussing a neighbour's garden. "Your orderly seems devoted, despite his small lapses." Sir Henry snorted, a flicker of amusement breaking through his reserve. "Gibbs is a clumsy fool at times, but harmless. Caught him pinching a cigar case, once thought I'd thrash him, but I let it go. Loyalty matters more than a trinket. He keeps the armory spotless, knows my habits." He paused, his eyes narrowing. "You think one of them did this, don't you? Shot me in my own room." Miss Marple's smile was serene, her needles resuming their quiet rhythm. "I think, General, that people are rarely what they seem. In St. Mary Mead, I knew a baker who seemed the soul of kindness, yet he poisoned a rival's flower over a petty slight. We must look at all possibilities. She rose, smoothing her skirt. Thank you for the chat, General. I'll let you rest. As she descended the stairs, Miss Marple's thoughts turned over the conversation like a seamstress examining fabric. Sir Henry's past was a tapestry of triumphs and tensions, with threads leading to each suspect. Colonel Vane's grudge was clear, a wound still raw after years. Captain Blake's restlessness suggested ambition or discontent, perhaps both. Lady Eleanor's strained marriage hinted at deeper resentments, and Gibbs's petty thefts raised questions about his trustworthiness. Each had a motive, however faint, and the Armory's locked door only sharpened the puzzle. In the drawing room, Beatrice awaited her, her hands clasped tightly. Jane, what did he say? Does he know who shot him? Her voice was a whisper, as if the walls themselves might betray a secret. Miss Marple settled into a chair, her knitting resuming its steady pace. He knows more than he says, Beatrice, but less than he thinks. His past is a map, and our suspects are marked upon it. We must follow the lines carefully. She glanced toward the window, where the rain had slowed to a drizzle, revealing the garden's sodden paths. The footprint she had seen beneath the Armory window lingered in her mind, a silent witness to someone's presence. Later that afternoon, Miss Marple joined Inspector Crawley in the library, where he was reviewing his notes with a furrowed brow. "The General's no help," he said, his tone tinged with frustration. "Says he was at his desk, heard a noise, then felt the shot, didn't see a soul. I've had the grounds searched again, nothing but that footprint you pointed out, and it's too faint to identify." Miss Marple nodded, her eyes on the fire crackling in the grate. "A footprint is a beginning, Inspector. In my village, a single boot mark led us to a poacher who thought himself clever. But tell me, have you considered the Armory's contents? Those rifles, the medals, anything missing?" Crawley's mustache twitched, as if he hadn't thought to ask. "Gibbs says everything's in place. The rifles are decorative, unloaded. The medals are all there, far as we can tell, but I'll have another look." He jotted a note, and Miss Marple smiled inwardly, knowing that small oversights often hid great truths. As the day drew to a close, Miss Marple took a turn through the Manor's library, her fingers trailing along the spines of military histories and memoirs. She paused at a volume on the Boer War, its pages well worn, and wondered if it held the key to Vane's bitterness. The General's past was a battlefield of its own, and Miss Marple suspected that the shot in the Armory was less about the present than about old scores, unsettled and waiting to be paid. Her needles clicked softly, weaving a pattern of suspicion as the rain outside whispered its own secrets. Chapter 5. The Aids Alibetha. Rain had cleared by mid-morning, leaving the grounds of Warrington Manor glistening under a tentative sun. The air carried the clean, earthy scent of damp grass, but within the manor's walls, the atmosphere remained heavy with suspicion. Miss Jane Marple, seated in the morning room with her knitting, observed the comings and goings of the household with her usual quiet attention. The shooting of General Sir Henry Warrington had stirred the manor like a stone dropped into a still pond, and the ripples were most evident in the strained faces of its occupants. Today, her thoughts turned to Captain Roger Blake, the General's aide, whose restless demeanour at breakfast had caught her eye like a loose thread in a tapestry. Inspector Crawley, ever methodical, had scheduled another round of interviews, and Captain Blake was first. Miss Marple, at Beatrice's insistence, joined him in the library, her presence unobtrusive as she settled into a backed chair, her needles clicking softly. The library was a grand room, its shelves lined with leather-bound volumes and its windows overlooking the garden's orderly paths. Crawley stood by the fireplace, his notebook open, his expression one of determined focus. Captain Blake entered, his uniform impeccable but his eyes shadowed, as if sleep had eluded him. "Captain Blake," Crawley began, his voice crisp, "let's go over your movements again. You say you were in this very room when the shot was fired, around 7 o'clock last evening, correct?" Blake nodded, his posture rigid. "Yes, Inspector. I was reading Clausewitz, I believe, military strategy. I often come here after dinner." His voice was steady, but Miss Marple noted the slight twitch of his fingers, clasped tightly behind his back. Crawley flipped a page in his notebook. "Mr. Harrow saw you here earlier, around 6. But no one can confirm your presence at 7. The shot was loud, surely you heard it." Blake's jaw tightened, and he shifted his weight. "I did. I thought it was a car backfiring, or perhaps one of the gardeners dropping something heavy. It wasn't until Harrow raised the alarm that I realized what had happened." His eyes flicked toward the window, and Miss Marple followed his gaze, noting the view of the Armory's exterior wall, partially obscured by the yew hedge. "And you didn't leave the library?" Crawley pressed, his pen poised. "No, sir. I was here until I heard the commotion and went to see what was wrong." Blake's tone was firm, but Miss Marple detected a faint strain, as if the words were rehearsed. She glanced at his boots, polished to a mirror shine, and recalled the faint trace of mud she had noticed on his cuff the previous day. The manor's paths had been dry before the rain, suggesting the mud came from elsewhere, perhaps the garden, near the Armory. Crawley made a note, his moustache twitching with skepticism. "No one saw you leave, but no one saw you stay either. Convenient, Captain. You've been with the General a long time. Any reason someone might think you'd turn on him?" Blake's face flushed, and his voice sharpened. "None, Inspector. Sir Henry gave me my career, my purpose. I owe him everything. I'd sooner shoot myself than harm him." His words were fervent, but Miss Marple's needles paused, her mind catching on the intensity of his denial. In St. Mary Mead, she had known a young man who protested his innocence with similar passion, only to be found hiding stolen goods in his attic. Loyalty, she knew, could mask other motives. Crawley nodded, though his eyes remained narrow. "Very well. We'll speak again, Captain. Don't leave the manor without informing me." Blake gave a curt nod and strode out, his steps echoing on the polished floor. As the door closed, Crawley turned to Miss Marple, his expression one of mild frustration. "He's hiding something, but I can't pin it down. His story holds, just one to back it up. What do you make of him?" Miss Marple's smile was gentle, her needles resuming their rhythm. "Captain Blake is a man under pressure, Inspector. Like a spring wound too tight, he might snap or simply quiver. I once knew a curate in my village who swore he was in church all evening. Yet his bicycle tires told a different story mud from a lane he'd no business visiting. We must look at the small things, Inspector." Crawley raised an eyebrow, but jotted a note. "Mud, you say? I'll have his clothes checked. Anything else catch your eye?" Miss Marple's eyes twinkled faintly. "Only that loyalty is a heavy burden, Inspector. It can bind a man to his duty, or choke him with resentment. Captain Blake's devotion to Sir Henry is clear, but devotion can curdle when it goes unrewarded." She said no more, but her mind lingered on Blake's restless hands, his fleeting glance at the garden and the mud that did not belong. After the interview, Miss Marple took a turn through the manor's lower corridors, her steps slow and deliberate. She paused by the door to the servants' hall, where Private Gibbs was polishing a silver tray, his movements quick and nervous. She offered him a kind smile, noting the way his eyes darted to the side, as if expecting a reprimand. "You keep things in fine order, Mr. Gibbs," she said, her tone warm. "The armory must be a challenge, with all those rifles." Gibbs flushed, his hands pausing. "It's not so bad, ma'am. The general likes things just so, and I do my best." His voice was soft, almost defensive, and Miss Marple nodded, filing away his unease. Returning to the garden, she retraced her steps to the armory's exterior wall, where the footprint she had noticed yesterday remained, now slightly blurred by the morning's rain. She bent to examine it, her shawl brushing the grass, and noted its size too large for a woman's shoe, but not decisive enough to point to one man. Nearby, a twig lay snapped, its break fresh, suggesting someone had passed recently. Miss Marple straightened, her mind weaving a pattern from these fragments. The footprint, the twig, Blake's muddy cuff, they were threads, not yet a fabric. But she knew they would connect in time. Back in the drawing room, Beatrice was waiting, her face drawn with worry. "Jane, you're out there poking about again," she said, her voice a mix of admiration and anxiety. "Have you found anything? Is it Roger? He's been so odd lately, not himself at all." Miss Marple settled into a chair, her knitting resuming its steady rhythm. "Captain Blake is a puzzle, Beatrice, but not the only one. In St. Mary Mead, I once knew a young man who swore he was in his shop all day, yet his boots carried clay from a riverbank he claimed never to visit. We must watch and listen, my dear. The truth is in the details." As the afternoon wore on, Miss Marple joined Beatrice for tea, her eyes drifting to the window where the garden lay quiet. She thought of Blake's fervent loyalty, his restless hands, and the mud that told a story he had not shared. The armory's locked door was a challenge, but Miss Marple knew that alibis, like locks, could be picked by those who knew where to press. Her needles clicked softly, each stitch a step, closer to unraveling the mystery of the shot general. Chapter 6. The Wife's Secret. The late afternoon light filtered through the rose-tinted curtains of Warrington Manor's conservatory, casting a soft glow over the lush greenery and delicate orchids that Lady Beatrice Warrington tended with such care. Miss Jane Marple, invited for a walk in the garden by Lady Eleanor Warrington, stepped lightly along the gravel path, her sensible shoes crunching softly, her knitting bag tucked under her arm. The invitation had come unexpectedly, a polite request delivered by a maid, and Miss Marple sensed an opportunity to probe the enigmatic figure of the general's wife. The shooting in the armory had left the household on edge, and Eleanor's cool detachment, like a perfectly cut gem, intrigued Miss Marple as much as it puzzled her. Lady Eleanor walked ahead, her green silk dress catching the light, her auburn hair gleaming under a wide-brimmed hat. She moved with the grace of a woman accustomed to being watched, yet there was a tightness to her posture, a hint of strain that Miss Marple's sharp eyes did not miss. The rose garden, fragrant with late blooms, was a quiet haven, its high hedges shielding them from the manor's prying windows. Eleanor paused by a cluster of crimson roses, her fingers brushing the petals as if seeking comfort in their softness. "These are Henry's favourites," she said, her voice low and measured. "He says they remind him of order, of discipline. I find them rather too perfect, don't you?" Her tone carried a faint edge, and Miss Marple adjusting her shawl, smiled gently. "Perfection can be a burden, Lady Eleanor," she replied, her voice as mild as a summer breeze. "In my village, St. Mary Mead, we had a gardener who grew flawless roses, but he fretted so over them that he forgot to enjoy their beauty. People, I find, are much the same." Eleanor's lips curved into a faint smile, but her eyes remained distant. "You're observant, Miss Marple. Beatrice says you see things others miss. I suppose you're trying to see through me now." Her words were light, almost teasing, but Miss Marple caught the undercurrent of wariness, only trying to understand. "My dear," Miss Marple said, her needles clicking softly as she drew them from her bag, a habit that steadied her thoughts. "A house like this holds many stories, and you've been part of its heart for years. It must be trying, with all this upset." Eleanor's fingers stilled on the rose, and for a moment her composure wavered. "Trying," she echoed, her voice barely above a whisper. "Henry lives for his wars, his strategies, his armory. I'm merely a decoration, Miss Marple, a frame for his medals. He's a good man, in his way, but—" She trailed off, her gaze fixed on the horizon, where the hills of St. Mary's Down blurred into the mist. Miss Marple nodded, her expression one of quiet sympathy. "A marriage can be a lonely place, even in a grand house. In St. Mary Mead, I knew a couple who seemed the picture of harmony, yet she kept a diary of grievances no one suspected. Small things, but they grew heavy over time." Eleanor's eyes flickered, and she turned to face Miss Marple, her face a mask of controlled emotion. "You're clever, aren't you? Seeing diaries where there are none." She laughed softly, but it was a brittle sound, like glass on the verge of cracking. "I was in my sitting room when it happened, you know, reading, alone. No one saw me, but then, no one ever does." Miss Marple's needles paused, her mind catching on the bitterness in Eleanor's words. "Your sitting room," she said, as if musing aloud. "It's near the Armory, isn't it? Such a quiet part of the house." Her tone was innocent, but her eyes were sharp, noting the slight flush that rose to Eleanor's cheeks. "Yes. Just down the corridor," Eleanor replied, her voice steady again. "But I heard nothing until the commotion began. Henry's armory is his world. I seldom go there." She plucked a rose petal and crushed it gently between her fingers, the gesture almost unconscious. Miss Marple nodded, her thoughts turning to a detail she had learned from the housekeeper. A maid had seen Eleanor near the armory door earlier that day, adjusting a vase of flowers in the hall. It was a small act, easily explained, yet Eleanor had not mentioned it. Flowers brighten a house, Miss Marple said, her tone conversational. "I understand you arranged some in the corridor yesterday, near the armory." A thoughtful touch. Eleanor's hand froze, the petal falling to the ground. "Did I?" she said, her voice light but her eyes narrowing. "I suppose I might have. The maids are so careless with the arrangements." She turned away, her movements brisk, and began walking toward the greenhouse. As if to end the conversation, Miss Marple followed, her steps slow but deliberate. She thought of Eleanor's delicate hands, the kind that could arrange flowers with precision or aim a pistol with equal care. In St. Mary Mead, she had known a woman who hid her anger behind a smile, her gentle hands mixing poison for a husband who ignored her. Eleanor's detachment, Miss Marple suspected, was a shield. But for what? In the greenhouse, Eleanor busied herself with a pot of orchids, her fingers deft as she adjusted the soil. "Henry doesn't care for these," she said, as if resuming an earlier thought. "Too fragile, he says. He prefers his rifles, his maps. I sometimes think he'd rather be back in the field than here with me." Her voice was calm, but Miss Marple heard the undercurrent of pain, the weight of years spent in the shadow of a man's ambition. Men like the General often carry their battles home, Miss Marple said, her tone gentle. But a wife sees more than most. You must know his habits, his visitors, perhaps even his enemies. Eleanor's lips tightened, and she set the pot down with a faint clink. Enemies? Henry has them, I suppose. Colonel Vane, for one, he's never hidden his dislike. Roger Blake, too, has been restless, though Henry thinks him loyal, and Gibbs, well, he's a thief, but harmless, I think. She paused, her eyes meeting Miss Marple's for a moment. You're looking for a motive, aren't you? I have none, Miss Marple. I live my life, and Henry lives his. Miss Marple's smile was serene, but her mind was alert. Motives are like seeds, Lady Eleanor. They start small, but given time, they grow. In my village, a woman once held a grudge over a forgotten anniversary, and it led to a broken window. Small things, but they matter. Eleanor laughed again, this time with a hint of genuine amusement. You're relentless, aren't you? Very well, I'll tell you this. Henry and I argued a few days ago. He thinks I spend too much on my charities, that I neglect the house. I told him he neglects me. It was nothing new. She shrugged, but her eyes were guarded, and Miss Marple noted the careful choice of words as they returned to the manor. Miss Marple's thoughts turned to the corridor. Near the Armory, she excused herself from Eleanor's company and made her way there, her steps quiet on the polished floor. The vase of flowers stood on a side table, its roses fresh but slightly askew, as if hastily arranged. She bent closer, noting a faint smudge on the table's edge, like a fingerprint in dust. It was a small thing, but Miss Marple knew that small things often told large stories. Later, in the drawing room, she joined Beatrice for tea, her knitting resuming its steady rhythm. Beatrice, her face drawn, leaned forward. Jane, what did Eleanor say? She's so composed, but I've seen her temper flare when she thinks no one's watching. Miss Marple's needles clicked softly. Lady Eleanor is a woman with secrets, Beatrice, but then, who isn't? In St. Mary Mead, I knew a lady who smiled at every tea party, yet her letters revealed a heart full of anger. We must watch her, but not judge too soon. Her eyes drifted to the window, where the rose garden lay quiet, its beauty hiding the thorns beneath. As the day faded into evening, Miss Marple reflected on Eleanor's words, her cool facade, and the smudge by the Armory. The General's wife was a puzzle, her detachment a mask for something deep, perhaps, or a plan carefully concealed. The Armory's locked door was a challenge, but Miss Marple knew that secrets, like roses, could be plucked with care, revealing the truth beneath their petals. Chapter 7. The orderlies fear the morning mist clung to the lawns of Warrington Manor, softening the edges of the world outside as if to belie the sharp tensions within. Miss Jane Marple, seated in the morning room with her knitting, watched the household stir with the cautious rhythm of a place under scrutiny. The shooting of General Sir Henry Warrington had cast a long shadow, and each member of the manor seemed to move through it with a guarded step. Today, Miss Marple's thoughts turned to Private Thomas Gibbs, the orderly whose nervous demeanour and petty thefts had piqued her curiosity. In St. Mary Mead, she had known young men like Gibbs unassuming, yet capable of surprising depths when cornered, and she sensed that his fear held a key to the Armory's mystery. Inspector Crawley had requested Gibbs's presence for another interview, and Miss Marple, with Beatrice's quiet endorsement, joined him in the library. The room, with its towering shelves and faint scent of old leather, felt like a stage for truths to be uncovered, and Miss Marple settled into her usual corner, her needles clicking softly, her presence as unobtrusive as a shadow. Gibbs entered, his wiry frame tense, his eyes darting like those of a trapped animal. His uniform was neat, but his hands, calloused from manual work, trembled slightly as he stood before Crawley. "Private Gibbs," Crawley began, his voice firm but not harsh, "you've told us you were in the pantry, polishing silver, when the shot was fired at 7 o'clock. Yet Mrs. Harrow, the housekeeper, says you were absent for nearly half an hour around that time. Care to explain?" Gibbs's face paled, and he licked his lips, his fingers twisting together. I was in the pantry, sir, most of the time. I stepped out for a moment, just to get some air. It was stuffy, sir." His voice was thin, almost pleading, and Miss Marple noted the sheen of sweat on his brow. Despite the coolness of the room, Crawley's mustache twitched, a sign of his growing impatience. "Air, you say? Convenient timing, Gibbs. You're in charge of the Armory's upkeep, keys, rifles, all of it. Did you leave the door unlocked that evening, or perhaps lend the key to someone?" Gibbs shook his head vigorously, his eyes wide. "No, sir. The General's strict about the Armory. I lock it after cleaning, always. The key stays with Mr. Harrow or the General himself. I'd never," he broke off, his breath uneven, and Miss Marple's needles paused, her gaze fixed on the young man's hands, which now clutched the edge of a chair for support. "You'd never what, Gibbs?" Crawley pressed, leaning forward. "You've been caught taking things before a cigar case, a pocket knife. The General let you off, but that doesn't mean you're above suspicion. Did you have a grudge against him?" Gibbs's eyes filled with a mixture of fear and indignation. "A grudge? No, sir. The General's been good to me, better than I deserve. I took those things stupid, I know, but I'd never harm him. He's like a father to me, in a way." His voice cracked, and he looked down, his shoulders hunching as if to shield himself from the accusation. Miss Marple's expression remained serene, but her mind was alert, sifting through Gibbs's words. His fear was genuine, she thought, but fear could stem from guilt or innocence alike. In St. Mary Mead, she had known a lad who trembled under questioning, not because he had stolen a neighbour's apples, but because he feared being blamed for. Worse, Gibbs's devotion to Sir Henry seemed sincere, yet his absence from the pantry raised questions, as did his access to the Armory's routines. "Tell me, Mr. Gibbs," Miss Marple said, her voice gentle, breaking the silence with the ease of a friend offering tea. "You must know the Armory well. Do you ever open the window to air it out, as Lady Beatrice mentioned?" Gibbs blinked, startled by her question. "Yes, ma'am, sometimes. The General likes it cool, but I open the window now and then, when I'm cleaning. Not that evening. They swear it." His eyes met hers, pleading for belief, and Miss Marple nodded, her needles resuming their rhythm. Crawley made a note, his expression skeptical. "We'll check on that window, Gibbs, and your whereabouts. Don't leave the manor without my say-so." Gibbs nodded, his face a picture of misery, and shuffled out, his steps heavy on the library floor. As the door closed, Crawley turned to Miss Marple, his brow furrowed. "He's scared, that's clear, but is it guilt or just nerves? The boy's got no alibi for that half hour, and he knows the Armory better than most. If that key was misplaced, Miss Marple's smile was gentle, her eyes thoughtful. Fear is a powerful thing, Inspector. In my village, I knew a shop boy who shook like a leaf when questioned about a missing purse, but it was only because he'd seen something he dared not tell. Gibbs may know more than he says, but we mustn't assume it's a confession. She thought of the broken cobweb she had noticed by the armory window, the faint scratch on the sill, and wondered if Gibbs's duties had placed him near that vulnerable point. After the interview, Miss Marple took a quiet turn through the Manor's service corridors, her steps slow as she passed the pantry where Gibbs claimed to have been. The room was small, its shelves lined with gleaming silver, but a narrow door led to the garden, and Miss Marple noted its proximity to the armory's exterior wall. She stepped outside, her shawl drawn against the damp air, and examined the path. The gravel was undisturbed, but a patch of soft earth nearby showed faint scuff marks, as if someone had stepped carelessly. They were not as clear as the footprints she had found earlier, but they suggested movement, perhaps hurried. Returning to the house, Miss Marple found Beatrice in the drawing room, her hands fidgeting with a lace handkerchief. "Jane, you've spoken to Gibbs," she said, her voice low. "Do you think he could have done it? He's such a nervous boy, but Henry trusted him." Miss Marple settled into a chair, her knitting resuming its steady pace. "Trust is a delicate thread, Beatrice. Gibbs is frightened, but whether of guilt or something else, I cannot say. In St. Mary Mead, I knew a young man who took trinkets from his employer, yet wept when accused of worse. We must look at Gibbs's actions, not just his fears." She thought of the pantry door, the scuff marks, and Gibbs's trembling hands, each a piece in the puzzle. As the day wore on, Miss Marple joined Inspector Crawley for a brief discussion in the hall. He had sent a constable to check the armory window again, focusing on the latch and sill. If Gibbs opened that window regularly, Crawley said, someone might have known it was a weak point, but he swears it was shut that evening. Miss Marple nodded, her eyes on the rain-washed garden beyond the window. "Weak points are often exploited, Inspector. In my village, a loose window latch let a thief into a vicar's study, though everyone swore it was locked. We must consider what Gibbs knows and what he fears to tell." Her needles clicked softly, weaving a pattern of suspicion as she pondered the orderly's role in the Manor's secrets. The armory's locked door was a riddle, but Miss Marple knew that fear, like a loose stitch, could unravel even the tightest alibi. Chapter 8. The rivals grudged the afternoon sky over St. Mary's, down hung heavy with clouds, casting a muted light across the village as Miss Jane Marple made her way along the cobbled path to the Green Man in the inn, in a sturdy building, with ivy clinging to its weathered stones, stood at the heart of the village. Its taproom, a hub for local gossip and travellers' tales. Miss Marple's purpose was singular, to speak with Colonel Marcus Vane, the General's old rival, whose presence in the village coincided too neatly with the shooting in the armory. Her knitting bag swung lightly at her side, a comforting weight. As she considered the threads of enmity that stretched back to the Boer War, in St. Mary Mead, she had seen old grudges fester like untended wounds, and she suspected Vane's bitterness held a clue to the Manor's mystery. The inn's interior was warm, with a fire crackling in the hearth and the scent of ale mingling with polished wood. Colonel Vane sat alone in a corner, a glass of whiskey before him, his scarred face set in a scowl that discouraged company. His broad shoulders and greying hair spoke of a life spent in command, but his eyes, cold and unyielding, suggested a man who had not forgotten past slights. Miss Marple approached with her usual unassuming air, her smile as gentle as a spring breeze. "Colonel Vane, I presume," she said, her voice soft but clear. "I'm Jane Marple, a friend of Lady Beatrice. Might I join you for a moment?" Vane's gaze flicked up, his expression one of grudging curiosity. "Miss Marple," he said, his voice a low growl, "I've heard of you. Beatrice's sleuthing spinster, eh? Sit, if you must." He gestured to the chair opposite, and Miss Marple settled into it, her knitting bag placed carefully at her feet. "I'm no sleuth, Colonel," she said, her eyes twinkling behind her spectacles. "Merely an old woman with a fondness for conversation. I understand you and General Warrington go back many years. A shared history must be full of stories." Vane's lips twisted into a bitter smile, and he took a sip of whiskey before answering. "Stories, yes. Not all of them pleasant. Warrington and I served together in the Boer Warkroonstad. 1900. A bloody mess, but a victory, thanks to my plan. He took the credit, though, and the promotions that followed. Left me to rot in a desk job while he climbed to glory." His voice was steady, but the anger in it was raw, as if the wound had been inflicted yesterday. Miss Marple nodded, her expression one of quiet sympathy. "A slight like that lingers, doesn't it? In my village, St. Mary Mead, I knew two farmers who quarrelled over a prize pig at a fair. They didn't speak for 20 years. But you're here now, Colonel. What brought you to St. Mary's Down?" Vane's eyes narrowed, but he answered readily enough. "Business. Old military records, a memoir I'm writing. Warrington's Manor is a convenient stop, and I thought to pay my respects for old times' sake." His tone was dry, almost mocking, and Miss Marple noted the way his fingers tightened around his glass, as if restraining a deeper impulse. "And the evening of the shooting?" she asked, her voice as mild as if inquiring about the whether you were here, I understand, dining alone. Vane nodded, his gaze steady. "At this very table, from 6 to 8. The innkeeper can tell you as much. I heard nothing of the shooting until the village was buzzing with it the next morning." His words were firm, but Miss Marple's keen. Eyes caught a flicker of something defiance, perhaps, or calculation. She leaned forward slightly, her needles emerging from her bag as if by habit. "This inn is charmingly close to the manor, isn't it? A short walk across the fields. In St. Mary Mead, I knew a man who claimed to be at the pub all evening, yet his dog was found muddy from a lane he swore he never took." Her tone was conversational, but her eyes were sharp, watching Vane's reaction. His scarred face remained impassive, but his fingers twitched, betraying a moment's unease. "I'm no dog, Miss Marple," he said, his voice low. "I was here, and I've no reason to sneak about Warrington's grounds. If you're fishing for a confession, you'll find my hooks empty." He drained his whiskey and set the glass down with a deliberate thud. Miss Marple smiled, unruffled. "Oh, I'm not fishing, Colonel, merely chatting. But old rivalries have a way of stirring trouble, don't they? Like a storm brewing for years." She rose, smoothing her skirt. "Thank you for your time. I shan't keep you from your memoir." As she stepped back into the village street, the cool air sharpened her thoughts. Vane's grudge was no mere anecdote. It was a living thing, coiled and ready to strike. His alibi, though supported by the innkeeper, was vague on timing, and Miss Marple recalled the villager's mention of a man resembling Vane near the manor's grounds that evening. She thought of the footprint by the armory window, the broken cobweb, and wondered if Vane's military precision extended to a more sinister act. Returning to the manor, Miss Marple found Inspector Crawley in the hall, conferring with a constable. He greeted her with a nod, his expression weary but attentive. "Miss Marple, you've been to see Vane, I hear. Any luck?" She settled onto a bench, her knitting resuming its steady rhythm. "Luck is a fickle thing, Inspector. Colonel Vane is a man with a long memory and a short temper. His alibi holds, but only just. In St. Mary Mead, I knew a man who swore he was at a card game, yet his pipe ash was found where he shouldn't have been. We must check the innkeeper's memory and, perhaps, the path from here to the inn." Crawley's mustache twitched with interest. "You think he slipped out?" "The innkeeper says he was there, but he's a busy man. Might not notice a short absence. I'll send a man to retrace the route." He made a note, then hesitated. "Vane's got motive, no doubt. That Boer War business sounds personal, but getting into a locked armory." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled faintly. "Locks are only as strong as the hands that turn them, Inspector. Vane knows firearms, knows the manor from past visits. A man like that plans carefully." She thought of the scratch on the armory's windowsill, the faint mark that suggested a tool, and wondered if Vane's memoir was a cover for a more vengeful purpose. Back in the drawing room, Beatrice was pacing, her hands twisting a handkerchief. "Jane, you've seen Vane," she said, her voice low. "He's a hard man, isn't he? Henry always said he was dangerous, but I never thought." Miss Marple patted her friend's hand, her touch reassuring. "Danger takes many forms. Beatrice, in my village, a quiet man once held a grudge over a lost promotion, and it led to a barn fire. We must watch Colonel Vane, but not blind ourselves to others." Her needles clicked softly, weaving a pattern of suspicion as she considered Vane's cold eyes, his steady alibi, and the shadow of a grudge that stretched across decades. The armory's mystery was a tangled web, but Miss Marple knew that even the strongest threads could be unravelled with care. Chapter 9. The cobweb cloth. The morning air at Warrington Manor carried a crisp edge, as if the world itself were bracing for the revelations that Miss Jane Marple sensed were drawing near. The manor's routines had resumed with a strained semblance of normalcy, but the shadow of the shooting lingered, like a discordant note in an otherwise orderly melody. Miss Marple, her knitting bag at her side, had spent the early hours reflecting on the fragments of evidence she had gathered: the footprint by the armory window, the scratch on the sill, the broken cobweb, and the subtle tells of the 4 suspects. Today she resolved to revisit the armory, certain that its silent walls held the key to unravelling the mystery of General Sir Henry Warrington's attacker. With Inspector Crawley's permission, Miss Marple entered the armory once more, her steps light on the polished floor. The room was, as she remembered, a fortress of military precision, its rifles gleaming on their racks, the desk still bearing the faint stain of blood where Sir Henry had fallen. The narrow window, high and unyielding, remained latched, its iron frame a stern guardian against intrusion. Yet Miss Marple's eyes were drawn to the sill, where the broken cobweb she had noticed earlier clung like a whispered secret. She bent closer, her shawl brushing the wall, and examined the delicate strands. They were not merely disturbed, but severed, as if something had passed through the window recently, despite its locked appearance. "Curious," she murmured, her voice soft but her mind sharp. She tested the latch again, noting its slight looseness, a subtle give that suggested it could be manipulated from outside with a thin tool. The scratch on the sill, faint but deliberate, supported her suspicion. Not a locked room at all. she said to herself, her eyes narrowing. Merely a room that wishes to seem so. Inspector Crawley joined her, his notebook in hand, his expression one of cautious interest. "Back at it, Miss Marple," he said, his mustache twitching. "You've got a bee in your bonnet about that window, haven't you?" Miss Marple smiled, her needles emerging from her bag as she settled onto a chair near the desk. "A bee, perhaps, Inspector, but a small one. In St. Mary Mead, I once knew a widow who swore her pantry was secure, yet a loose latch let a thief slip in for her jam. This window, I think, is our pantry." She pointed to the cobweb, its broken strands catching the light. "Something passed through here, and recently. The latch is not as firm as it seems." Crawley crouched to examine the sill, his fingers tracing the scratch. "You're right," he said, his tone grudgingly impressed. "It's loose, and this mark could be a knife or a wire. Someone could have slipped it open from outside, shot the general, and closed it again. But why no gun? And how did they get out without being seen?" Miss Marple's needles clicked steadily, her mind weaving a pattern from the evidence. "A clever person plans for such things, Inspector. The gun could have been hidden or taken away. As for leaving, the garden is secluded, and the yew hedge hides much. In my village, a poacher once slipped through a garden unseen because everyone was looking elsewhere." Crawley made a note, his brow furrowed. "We've searched the garden, nothing but that footprint, and it's too faint to pin on anyone. But this window changes things. Gibbs said he airs it out sometimes, so he'd know it's loose. Blake or Vane could have noticed it too, from past visits. Even Lady Eleanor might have seen it, passing by the corridor." Miss Marple nodded, her eyes on the cobweb. "Knowledge is a dangerous thing, Inspector. Each of our suspects knows the manor in their own way. We must ask who had the wit and the will to use this window." She rose, her gaze lingering on the desk, where the bullet casing still lay, its brass surface a silent accusation. She thought of the dust ring she had noticed earlier, a faint circle where something had been moved, and wondered if it held a clue to the missing weapon. Leaving the armory, Miss Marple walked to the garden, her steps slow as she approached the yew hedge. The footprint she had seen before was fainter now, softened by rain, but the snapped twig nearby remained. Its break clean and recent. She knelt, her fingers brushing the earth, and noted a second marker, shallow indentation, as if something heavy had rested there briefly. A ladder, perhaps, or a tool. She filed the detail away, her mind turning to the suspect's movements on the evening of the shooting. Back in the manor, she found Beatrice in the drawing room, her face pale with worry. "Jane, you've been at the armory again," she said, her voice low. "Have you found something? The servants are whispering, saying it's a ghost or some nonsense." Miss Marple patted her friend's hand, her touch reassuring. "No ghosts, Beatrice, only people with secrets. In St. Mary Mead, a broken window pane led us to a burglar who thought himself invisible. This cobweb is our window pane, and it tells us someone was clever enough to breach the armory's defences." She thought of Captain Blake's muddy cuff, Lady Eleanor's proximity to the armory, Gibbs's nervous hands, and Colonel Vane's cold precision. Each could have known the window's weakness, but only one had used it. Later, Miss Marple joined Crawley for tea in the library, where he shared the results of his latest inquiries. "The innkeeper's memory is shakier than Vane let on," he said. "He can't swear Vane was at the inn the whole evening, says he stepped out for a smoke around 6:30, and Blake's boots had mud, but he claims it's from a walk. Earlier that day, Gibbs sticks to his pantry story, and Lady Eleanor still vague about her sitting room. Miss Marple's needles clicked softly, her eyes thoughtful. A smoke, a walk, a moment alone, small gaps. Inspector, but large enough for mischief. In my village, a man once claimed he was tending his roses, yet his shears were found by a neighbour's gate. We must look at these gaps and what they hide. She thought of the cobweb, the scratch, the indentation in the garden, and knew they pointed to a plan as deliberate as it was bold. As the day faded, Miss Marple sat by the drawing-room window, her knitting a steady rhythm against the manners, tension. The Armory's locked door was no longer a barrier but a deception, its window a silent witness to a crime that was both personal and precise. The cobweb clue had shifted the puzzle, and Miss Marple felt the threads of suspicion tightening, ready to reveal the hand that had pulled the trigger. Chapter 10. The motive unravelled. The late afternoon light bathed Warrington Manor in a golden haze, softening the stern lines of its Georgian facade, but doing little to ease the tension that gripped its inhabitants. Miss Jane Marple, seated in the drawing-room with her knitting, felt the threads of the mystery drawing together, like a pattern emerging from her needles. The cobweb clue, the loose latch, the footprint, and the subtle tells of the four suspects: Captain Roger Blake, Lady Eleanor Warrington, Private Thomas Gibbs, and Colonel Marcus Vainhad, formed a tapestry of suspicion. Today, with Inspector Crawley's investigation reaching a critical point, Miss Marple resolved to lay out her observations, trusting that the truth, like a well-stitched seam, would hold under scrutiny. Beatrice, her face etched with worry, had arranged for the suspects to gather in the drawing-room at Miss Marple's request. The air was thick with anticipation as they entered, each carrying the weight of their secrets. Captain Blake stood by the fireplace, his hands clasped behind his back, his eyes restless. Lady Eleanor sat poised on a velvet settee, her expression as cool as porcelain, though her fingers twisted a lace handkerchief. Private Gibbs hovered near the door, his wiry frame tense, his gaze fixed on the floor. Colonel Vane took a chair by the window, his scarred face impassive, his grey eyes hard. As Flint, Inspector Crawley stood at the room's centre, his notebook tucked away, his demeanour one of quiet authority. Miss Marple, her knitting in her lap, began to speak, her voice gentle but commanding attention. "Ladies and gentlemen," she said, her eyes moving from one face to another, "a crime has been committed in this house, and it is no ordinary one. General Warrington was shot in a room thought to be impregnable, yet the Armory was breached, not by force, but by cunning. In my village, St. Mary Mead, I have seen how small things a broken twig, a misplaced word reveal great truths. Let us consider what we know." She turned first to Captain Blake, her gaze steady. "Captain, your loyalty to Sir Henry is clear, but loyalty can chafe when ambition stirs. You were in the library, you say, yet your boots carried mud from the garden, and your restlessness speaks of a man seeking more than his current lot." Blake's jaw tightened, but he remained silent, his fingers twitching slightly. Next, she addressed Lady Eleanor, her tones soft but probing. "Lady Eleanor, a marriage strained by neglect can breed resentment. You were in your sitting room, alone, yet a maid saw you near the Armory earlier that day, arranging flowers, a task you did not mention. Small secrets, my dear, have a way of growing." Eleanor's cheeks flushed faintly, but her eyes held Miss Marple's. Unyielding to Private Gibbs, she spoke with kindness, noting his trembling hands. "Mr. Gibbs, your devotion to the General is touching, yet your absence from the pantry at the critical moment raises questions. You know the Armory's habits, its window's weaknesses. Fear can make a man silent, but silence can betray him. Gibbs's eyes widened, and he shook his head, his voice a whisper. I didn't, ma'am, I swear. Finally, Miss Marple gaze settled on Colonel Vane, her expression serene but her words precise. Colonel Vane, your grudge against Sir Henry is no secret. The Boer War left scars deeper than those on your face, and your presence in the village is no mere coincidence. You were at the inn, you say, yet the innkeeper cannot swear to your every moment. You know firearms, Colonel, and you know this. Manner from years past. A man with your skill could plan a shot to wound, not kill, to settle an old score with humiliation rather than death. Vane's face darkened, his voice a low growl. You're spinning tales, Miss Marple. I was at the inn, and I've no reason to skulk about Warrington's Armory. Prove it, if you can. Miss Marple's needles clicked softly, her smile unruffled. Proof, Colonel, is in the details. The Armory's window, latched and seemingly secure, was its weakness. A loose latch, a scratch on the sill, a broken cobweb. These tell us someone entered from outside, fired the shot, and left, relatching the window to create the illusion of a locked room. The footprint in the garden, the snapped twig, the faint indentation point to a careful plan executed by someone who knew the manor's secrets. Crawley, listening intently, stepped forward. Miss Marple, you're saying the window was the key, but who? Each of them had opportunity and motive in their way. Miss Marple nodded, her eyes moving to Vane. Indeed, Inspector, but let us consider the heart of this crime. Captain Blake's ambition might drive him to betrayal, but his muddied boots suggest carelessness, not calculation. Lady Eleanor's resentment is real, but her delicate hands are better suited to roses than revolvers. Gibbs's fear is palpable, but his petty thefts lacked the boldness of this act. Colonel Vane, however, has the skill, the knowledge, and the motive, a grudge nursed for decades, a desire not to kill but to shame a rival who stole his glory. Vane's chair scraped as he leaned forward, his voice sharp. You're guessing, old woman. Where's your evidence? A cobweb and a scratch. Don't make a case. Miss Marple's smile was serene, her needles pausing. In St. Mary Mead, Colonel, a single thread on a gatepost led us to a thief who thought himself clever. I suggest, Inspector, a search of Colonel Vane's room at the inn. A man of his precision might keep a memento of his triumpher tool, perhaps, or the weapon itself. Crawley's eyes narrowed, and he nodded. Constable, see to it. Search the Colonel's luggage, every inch. Vane's face remained impassive, but Miss Marple noted the slight clenching of his fist, a sign that her words had struck a nerve. As the constable left, Miss Marple turned to Beatrice, who sat pale and wide-eyed. Jane, do you really think? It's him, she whispered. Vane's always been cold, but this coldness can burn, Beatrice, Miss Marple replied, her voice gentle. In my village, a man once set a trap for a rival over a long-forgotten slight. We must wait for the inspector's findings, but the threads are coming together. Her needles resumed their rhythm, each click a step closer to the truth. The room fell silent, the suspects exchanging glances, each grappling with their own thoughts. Miss Marple's mind was clear, her suspicions honed by the cobweb clue and the pattern of Vane's past. The Armory's mystery was unraveling, and she felt the weight of certainty settling, like a finished row in her knitting, ready to reveal the hand that had fired the shot. Chapter 11. The confession, the evening shadows lengthened across Warrington Manor, casting intricate patterns on the drawing room's walls as the household awaited the results of Inspector Crawley's search. Miss Jane Marple sat quietly, her knitting a steady rhythm in her hands, her eyes calm but alert. The tension in the room was palpable. A taut thread connecting the four suspects, Captain Roger Blake, Lady Eleanor Warrington, Private Thomas Gibbs, and Colonel Marcus Vaynich, seated in uneasy silence. Beatrice, her hands clasped tightly, glanced at Miss Marple with a mixture of hope and dread, as if sensing the mystery's resolution was near. The cobweb clue, the loose latch, and the faint marks in the garden had pointed Miss Marple toward Vane, and now the truth hung in the balance. Waiting for evidence to tip the scales, Inspector Crawley returned, his face set in a grim line, a constable at his side carrying a small leather case. The room stirred, eyes turning to him as he placed the case on the table with deliberate care. "Colonel Vane," Crawley said, his voice steady but firm, "we've searched your room at the Green Man Inn. Care to explain this?" He opened the case to reveal a compact pistol, its barrel polished but unmistakably used, alongside a thin metal tool, its edge worn as if from frequent use. Vane's scarred face remained impassive, but his eyes flickered, a spark of defiance beneath the steel. "That's mine," he admitted, his voice low. "I keep it for protection. Old habits from the field. But you'll find it hasn't been fired in months." Crawley's mustache twitched, and he held up a small evidence bag containing a bullet casing. "We'll test it, Colonel, but this casing from the Armory matches the caliber of your pistol, and this tool perfect for slipping a latch, wouldn't you say?" He turned to Miss Marple, a nod of acknowledgement in his eyes. "Your suggestion was spot on, Miss Marple. The latch on the Armory window was loose, and this tool could have done the job." Miss Marple's needles paused, her expression serene but her mind sharp. "In St. Mary Mead, Colonel, a gardener, once used a wire to open a shed, thinking no one would notice. But small things betray us cobwebs, scratches, a tool left behind." Her voice was gentle, but her words carried weight, and Vane's jaw tightened, his hands clenching into fists. The other suspects stirred, their faces a mix of shock and relief. Blake's shoulders relaxed slightly, as if a burden had lifted, while Eleanor's lips parted, her cool facade cracking. Gibbs, still near the door, looked as if he might bolt, his eyes wide with fear. Beatrice gripped Miss Marple's arm, whispering, "Is it really him, Jane?" Miss Marple patted her hand, her gaze fixed on Vane. "Let us hear what the Colonel has to say, Beatrice. A man with a grudge carries it like a weight, and sometimes it breaks him." Vane's eyes met hers, and for a moment the room seemed to hold its breath. Then, with a slow exhalation, his defiance crumbled, his shoulders sagging as if the years of bitterness had finally claimed him. "All right," he said, his voice rough but steady. "It was me. I shot Warrington, but I didn't mean to kill him, only to make him feel the sting of failure, the way he made me feel all those years ago." The room erupted in murmurs, but Crawley raised a hand for silence. "Go on, Colonel. Tell us how you did it." Vane leaned back, his scarred face lit by the fire's glow, and began to speak, his words measured but heavy. "Kroonstad, 1900. My plan, my victory, but Warrington took the credit, left me in the dust. I lost my command, my future, while he rose to glory. I've carried that for decades, and when I came to the village for my memoir, I saw my chance. I knew the manor from old visits, knew the Armory, its window, its habits. Gibbs aired it out sometimes, left the latch loose. I watched, planned, waited. He paused, his eyes distant. That evening, I slipped out of the inn during a lull, took the path through the fields, kept to the shadows. The yew hedge hid me as I worked the latch with my tool quiet, quick. Warrington was at his desk, his back to the window. I fired one shot, aimed for his shoulder, not his heart. I wanted him to live, to know humiliation, to feel what I felt. Then I closed the window, relatched it, and was back at the inn before. Anyone missed me? Crawley's pen scratched furiously, recording every word. And the pistol? He asked. Kept it with me, Vane said. Thought I'd dispose of it later, but I underestimated you and her. He nodded toward Miss Marple, a grudging respect in his eyes. The cobweb, the scratch-you, saw what I thought no one would. Miss Marple's needles resumed their rhythm, her expression unchanged. People are careless with small things. Colonel, in St. Mary Mead, a man once hid a stolen watch, but a speck of polish on his sleeve gave him away. Your grudge was your undoing. Crawley signalled to the constable, who stepped forward with handcuffs. Colonel Marcus Vane, you're under arrest for the attempted murder of General Sir Henry Warrington. You'll come with us. Vane rose, his movements stiff but unresisting, his face a mask of resignation as he was led from the room. Blake exhaled, running a hand through his hair, while Eleanor's handkerchief fell to her lap, her composure shaken. Gibbs, trembling, sank into a chair, his relief palpable. Beatrice turned to Miss Marple, her eyes brimming. Jane, you did it. You saw what none of us could. Miss Marple's smile was gentle, her needles clicking softly. I only looked, Beatrice. People reveal themselves, if you watch closely enough. She thought of the cobweb, the latch, the footprints, more threads that had woven a net around. Vane's guilt. The Armory's mystery was solved, but Miss Marple knew that human hearts, with their grudges and regrets, would always hold secrets waiting to be unravelled. Chapter 12. The quiet resolution. The morning sun broke through the clouds over St. Mary's Down, casting a gentle light across Warrington Manor's gardens, as if to cleanse the lingering shadows of the past day's turmoil. The arrest of Colonel Marcus Vane had brought a hush to the household, a stillness that felt both fragile and profound, like the calm after a storm. Miss Jane Marple, her knitting bag packed and her shawl neatly folded, stood in the Manor's hall, preparing to depart for St. Mary Mead. Her visit, meant to be a quiet interlude with her friend Lady Beatrice Warrington, had become a tapestry of secrets unravelled, and she felt the quiet satisfaction of a puzzle well solved. General Sir Henry Warrington, though still pale and bandaged, had insisted on seeing her off. He stood at the foot of the grand staircase, his posture rigid despite the sling that cradled his wounded shoulder. His eyes, sharp as ever, met hers with a grudging respect. Miss Marple, he said, his voice gruff but softened by sincerity. I'm not one for sentiment, but you've done me a service. I thought Vane a bitter man, but never this. You saw what I couldn't. Miss Marple's smile was gentle, her eyes twinkling behind her spectacles. You're very kind, General. In my village, St. Mary Mead, I've learned that old wounds can fester in the quietest hearts. Your armory was a stage, and Colonel Vane played his part too well. She adjusted her shawl, her thoughts lingering on the cobweb, the loose latch, and the footprint that had betrayed Vane's careful plan. Lady Eleanor approached, her elegance undimmed but her demeanour warmer, as if the resolution had lifted a weight from her shoulders. "Miss Marple," she said, her voice soft, "I misjudged you. I thought your questions impertinent, but you've given us peace, Henry and I. We've much to mend." She glanced at her husband, a flicker of something hope, perhaps passing between them. Miss Marple nodded, her expression kind, mending. "Takes time, Lady Eleanor, but it begins with truth. In St. Mary Mead, a couple once rebuilt their marriage after a theft was uncovered, simply by speaking plainly. You've a chance for that now." Her words were gentle, but they carried the weight of experience, and Eleanor's lips curved into a faint, grateful smile. Captain Roger Blake, standing nearby, stepped forward, his restlessness replaced by a quiet resolve. "I owe you an apology, Miss Marple," he said, his voice steady. "I was sharp with you, fearing you'd suspect me, but you've cleared the air. I'll stay with the General, my place is here." His eyes were clear, and Miss Marple noted the absence of the muddy cuff, as if he, too, had shed a burden. "Young men often carry more than they show, Captain," she replied, her tone warm. "In my village, a lad once hid his fears behind a bold front, but honesty set him free. You've a good heart, trust it." Blake nodded, a hint of relief in his expression. Private Gibbs, lingering at the edge of the hall, approached hesitantly, his wiry frame less tense but still marked by nervous energy. "Ma'am," he mumbled, his eyes on the floor, "I'm sorry for the trouble. The General's letting me stay, but I'll not take anything again, I swear." His voice was earnest, and Miss Marple saw in him the echo of a St. Mary Mead boy who had learned his lesson after a pilfered apple. "Honesty is a fine start." "Mr. Gibbs," she said, her smile encouraging, "keep to it, and you'll find your place." Gibbs nodded, his shoulders straightening, as if her words had given him a new footing. Beatrice, hovering nearby, clasped Miss Marple's hands, her eyes brimming. "Jane, you've saved us all," she said, her voice trembling. "I was so afraid, but you saw through it all, the cobweb, the window, everything. How can I thank you?" Miss Marple patted her friend's hand, her touch reassuring. "You've thanked me with your friendship, Beatrice. In St. Mary Mead, I've seen how truth heals, even when it stings. Your house is whole again, cherish it." Her needles, tucked into her bag, seemed to carry the rhythm of her thoughts, each stitch a testament to the care with which she had unravelled the mystery. Inspector Crawley joined them, his notebook tucked away, his expression one of quiet admiration. "Miss Marple, you've a gift," he said, his moustache twitching with a rare smile. "That window latch, the cobweb, have missed them. Veins confessed fully, and the pistol's been tested. It's the one that fired the shot. You've made my job easier." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "I only looked, Inspector. In St. Mary Mead, a broken thread once led to a thief, and here, a cobweb led to a grudge. People are the same everywhere, if you watch them closely." She thought of Vane, now in custody, his decades-old bitterness finally laid bare, and felt a pang of pity for a man consumed by his own past. As the carriage arrived to take her to the station, Miss Marple took one last look at the manor, its windows gleaming in the morning light. The Armory, once a fortress of secrets, was quiet now, its mystery resolved. She climbed aboard, her knitting bag at her side, and as the carriage rolled away, she resumed her needles, their steady click a counterpoint to her thoughts. Old grudges, like tangled wool, could unravel lives, but with care they could be set right. As the train carried her toward St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple reflected on the patterns of human nature, as intricate and revealing as the stitches she wove, ready for the next puzzle that awaited her.